Welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive. If you're listening right now, it's because you handed us a stack of documents that at first glance looks, well, entirely disconnected.
Oh, completely disconnected. I
Yeah.
mean, we're looking at a pile that includes English language learning manuals, dense linguistics papers on the dialect of Southern California, historical data on the agricultural revolution, and actual architectural blueprints for an underwater resort in Fiji.
Yeah, it's wild. It's a truly eclectic mix of information. But when you analyze these documents side by side, a highly specific and honestly really compelling theme comes up.
Right. This deep dive is fundamentally about human adaptation. We are exploring how we push past our cognitive limits to acquire complex new skills, how our everyday speech evolves in ways that are often deeply misunderstood, and how we physically adapt to extreme environments.
From the grueling reality of ancient farms to the intense pressure of the ocean floor. So settle in. We're going to take you on a journey through human evolution and resilience. And it actually starts right inside the brain. We want to look at the mechanics of how we learn, and more importantly, how we adapt when that learning process suddenly stalls out.
Which brings us to the language learning materials you provided, specifically the research on the B1 to B2 plateau.
Oh, the dreaded plateau.
Yes, anyone who has tried to master a foreign language, or really any complex cognitive skill, recognizes this phenomena. You experience a period of rapid initial progress, and then you hit a seemingly impenetrable wall.
It is incredibly frustrating. You reach a point where the language no longer terrifies you, but your progress just sort of feels like treading water.
Right, you're just stuck.
And the documentation outlines some highly specific structural reasons for this stagnation. It's rarely a lack of intelligence or effort. A major factor is simply study routine fatigue.
Yes, your brain becomes neurologically habituated to the same textbooks and the same flashcards, which leads to a plateau in retention.
There's also the issue of relying on a limited, comfortable vocabulary.
But perhaps the most significant hurdle identified in the research is a paralyzing fear of mistakes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
At the intermediate level, you've developed enough competence to be acutely aware of your own incompetence. You finally know enough grammar to realize exactly how many errors you are making in real time.
So you just freeze up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Consequently, learners often retreat into their comfort zones and speak less to avoid embarrassment.
Which is counterproductive when you look at the standard European guidelines for language proficiency, known as the CEFR.
Right, the Common European Framework.
Yeah. To officially hit that B2 level, the can-do statements require a learner to take an active part in spontaneous conversations. You have to be able to express viewpoints and construct arguments without awkwardly searching for words.
You simply cannot achieve that fluency if you're constantly policing your own grammar out of fear. You have to bridge the gap between passive understanding and active communication.
And the solutions offered in these documents all revolve around radically changing the learning environment to force adaptation. Immersion is the gold standard here.
Always.
There's a great anecdote in the documentation from a Reddit user that perfectly illustrates this. They had returned to the US after living in France, and they were so determined not to lose their linguistic momentum that they specifically moved to Quebec to finish their undergraduate degree entirely in French.
Wow.
Yeah. They essentially engineered an environment where they had to read, write, speak, and listen in the target language just to maintain their academic standing.
It's an extreme strategy, but highly effective because it removes the option to default to a native language.
Right. But for those of us who can't simply pack up and relocate to Quebec, the materials suggest simulating that immersion by shifting the cognitive load.
Which means instead of focusing on the language itself, you focus on an engaging context.
This is where the graded short stories come in. I found this fascinating. Instead of reading rudimentary sentences about the weather, learners are given narratives designed to pull them in emotionally.
Like the stories by Ollie Richards mentioned in the sources.
Yes. You might read a historical fiction piece about Thork the Viking searching for new territory, or a modern story about a guy named Daniel panicking because his phone battery died in Valencia and he desperately needs to reach his family.
And from a neurological standpoint, that relatable panic is crucial. When a learner becomes emotionally invested in a character's dead phone battery, the brain stops treating the foreign vocabulary as a disconnected list of words to be memorized.
It treats those words as vital pieces of information required to solve a narrative puzzle.
Exactly. The context does the heavy lifting, bypassing the study fatigue entirely.
We see a similar strategy with the notoriously difficult topic of phrasal verbs. The provided materials from an online English school pair complex verbs with specific, highly memorable moments in pop culture.
Right, tying them to visual memories.
Yeah. You learn the phrase blow up by visualizing a specific scene in the movie Deadpool. You internalize ask out through a scene in Despicable Me 2 or get up by watching Iron Man suit up.
It's all about anchoring the linguistic data to something the brain already finds stimulating. The documentation heavily advocates for using native-level podcasts for this exact same reason.
Like the podcast Serial, which totally exploded in popularity.
Or Overheard at National Geographic, where explorers discuss bizarre phenomena like zombie mice or underwater pyramids.
By focusing your attention on a gripping true crime mystery or an obscure science fact, language acquisition essentially becomes a byproduct of your own curiosity.
And we see that exact same survival mechanism, finding an efficient workaround to navigate a complex environment when we look at how native speakers actually use language in the wild.
Because real-world communication is rarely as textbook perfect as we're taught.
No, it's much messier, but also much more efficient. Take the way teenagers in Southern California speak, which is heavily analyzed in the linguistics papers you provided.
Valley speak.
Valley speak. It's a linguistic phenomenon that is frequently dismissed by mainstream culture as frivolous or uneducated. But when linguists actually analyze the data, they find a highly evolved, highly functional form of communication.
We should probably dispel a major myth right away, because the stereotype is that Valley speak is exclusively used by affluent young women hanging out at shopping malls in the 1980s.
The demographic data proves otherwise. A comprehensive study conducted by Amanda Richard at UC San Diego analyzed college-age students from highly diverse socioeconomic backgrounds across Southern California.
And what did they find?
While the study found that women initiated certain linguistic features more frequently, the vast majority of men in Southern California also utilize Valley speak. It functions as a pervasive regional dialect, not an isolated sociolect.
The actual mechanics of this dialect are fascinating. Let's look at uptalk, which linguists call the high-rising terminal. This is the habit of ending a declarative statement with an upward inflection, making it sound like a question. To an unfamiliar ear, it often sounds like the speaker lacks confidence or is constantly asking for validation.
That's the common perception, but the research reveals brilliant, pragmatic uses for uptalk. One primary function is floor holding.
Floor holding.
Yeah. In a fast-paced social dynamic, ending on a rising intonation subconsciously signals to the listener that the speaker is not finished making their point. It's an auditory cue that says, I have more to say, do not interrupt me yet.
So it's essentially a conversational checkpoint.
Precisely. And the UC San Diego study highlighted another major use, confirming comprehension.
Right. When participants were asked to give complicated directions on a map, a full 100% of them used uptalk. They would say things like, go all the way to the right in the middle where it says Canyon Hills.
It allows the speaker to continuously check that the listener is following along without having to actually stop the flow of information to ask, do you understand? It's a highly efficient linguistic adaptation.
The documentation also defends the heavy use of the word like, which is traditionally, heavily stigmatized as a sign of a poor vocabulary.
Linguistically, like often functions as a crucial discourse marker. It is unstressed and does not alter the fundamental meaning of the sentence. What it does is buy the speaker crucial milliseconds of cognitive processing time to formulate their next thought.
It serves the exact same functional purpose as saying or but it's uniquely embedded into the syntax of the dialect.
Exactly.
It's also used in a way the documents call a colloquial quotative, which I found really interesting.
How so?
Well, if someone says, and I was like, don't ever speak to my boyfriend again, they're rarely claiming they uttered those literal words. They're expressing the internal attitude or the specific vibe they were feeling in that moment. It's communicating an emotional truth rather than providing a verbatim transcription.
It adds a layer of emotional nuance to the storytelling. But the adaptation of our speech is not always met with social acceptance, which brings us to the research on vocal fry.
Ah, yes. This is the creaky, guttural vibration that happens at the very end of sentences, famously associated with public figures like Kim Kardashian.
It comes down to acoustics. Vocal fry introduces what linguists call jitter and shimmer.
Which sounds highly technical, but it's basically just uneven vocal vibrations, correct?
That is exactly what it is. Jitter refers to a variation in pitch. Your vocal cords are literally fluttering unevenly. Shimmer refers to a variation in volume. When you combine those two microscopic irregularities at the absolute bottom of your vocal register, it creates that distinct crackling, popping sound.
And while the data shows that both men and women utilize vocal fry, there is a stark double standard in how society reacts to it. The documentation points out that when women adapt their speech to include vocal fry, listeners frequently perceive them as less competent, less educated, and crucially, less hireable in a professional setting.
It highlights the severe, real-world consequences of adaptation. We are constantly adjusting how we sound to fit into social hierarchies, to hold the floor in a meeting, or to project a certain attitude. But society rigorously judges those adaptations, often unfairly.
We adapt our words to survive in complex social environments, but historically, human beings have had to radically adapt their physical lives to survive in entirely new geographical environments, which shifts us from the linguistics papers to the historical and scientific data in your stack.
The scale of adaptation changes here, from the microscopic fluttering of vocal cords to the structural transformation of the entire human skeleton.
When reviewing the historical text on the agricultural revolution, the standard narrative we're usually taught is one of glorious progress. Humans figured out how to domesticate crops, we stopped wandering around, we built cities, and civilization flourished.
That's the textbook version.
Right. But the data presents a massive paradox. For the individual human being, the transition to farming was an absolute catastrophe.
It was a demographic success for the species, but a physical nightmare for the individual. The source relies heavily on paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases in human remains, to reveal the dark side of this transition.
Agriculture undeniably created a massive food surplus, which allowed populations to boom.
But the physical cost paid by early farmers was staggering.
When you look at the daily life of hunter-gatherers compared to early farmers, the contrast is brutal. Hunter-gatherers actually enjoyed a highly varied, nutrient-rich diet of wild plants and lean proteins, and they spent significantly fewer hours securing that food.
And when humans transitioned to intensive farming, our diets became severely restricted to a few starchy crops, like wheat or maize.
These crops provided cheap, abundant calories to feed a growing population, but they offered abysmal nutritional value.
The skeletal evidence from this period is undeniable. The documents highlight studies by George Armelagos on Native American skeletons recovered from burial mounds in the Illinois and Ohio River valleys.
These remains date back to around 1150 AD, a period when these cultures shifted to intensive, large-scale maize farming.
And the skeletons of these early farmers displayed significant, widespread health deficiencies that were virtually absent in their hunter-gatherer ancestors.
There was a very specific bone condition mentioned in the paleopathology data, porotic hyperostosis.
Yes, porotic hyperostosis leaves distinct spongy lesions on the skull. It is a clear indicator of severe iron deficiency anemia. The researchers found that this condition increased fourfold in these farming populations.
The researchers also found bone lesions that pointed to a massive rise in infectious diseases. This makes perfect sense when you consider the environmental shift.
How so?
Well, agriculture forced people to settle permanently, living closely together in crowded, often unsanitary villages where waste accumulated and epidemics could easily spread through the population.
That's a very valid point. Furthermore, the skeletons showed a sharp rise in degenerative spinal conditions, directly resulting from the grueling, repetitive physical labor required to clear land, plant seeds, and harvest crops by hand.
The broader statistics paint a grim picture of this adaptation. Following the widespread adoption of agriculture, the average human life expectancy plummeted from 26 years down to just 19 years.
And human beings actually shrank. Skeletons recovered from Greece and Turkey demonstrate that around 10,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer men averaged about 5'9" tall. By 3000 BC, after committing fully to agriculture, the average male height had dropped to 5'3".
We traded our physical health for sheer numbers.
It perfectly illustrates the harsh reality of pushing past our environmental limits. The lasting impact of the agricultural revolution was that it allowed Homo sapiens to succeed and dominate the planet by drastically increasing the total amount of available calories.
But the short-term reality for thousands of years was that small bands of relatively healthy, tall foragers were replaced by massive villages of malnourished, diseased, and overworked people.
We sacrificed individual well-being to adapt to a new system of survival.
And the incredible thing is, we're still pushing past our environmental limits today. We are still looking for new environments to conquer, which brings us to the final and undoubtedly most sci-fi document in your stack, the blueprints for the Poseidon Undersea Resort.
We are looking at the transition from the soil to the seabed. 50 years after Jacques Cousteau captured the public imagination with the idea of living underwater, engineers are actively attempting to build sustainable, long-term human habitats on the ocean floor.
The documentation focuses on a structure called the H2O, designed by Bruce Jones for a luxury resort in Fiji. The concept involved luxury living spaces sitting 15 to 20 meters below the surface of the ocean, surrounded by marine life.
But the engineering required to achieve this safely is a logistical nightmare. The primary obstacle to human beings living underwater isn't actually supplying enough oxygen. It is managing the immense weight and pressure of the water itself. For the last 50 years, most underwater scientific habitats have operated at ambient pressure. This means the air pressure inside the habitat is artificially pressurized to match the heavy water pressure outside.
The human body can technically survive that, but it creates massive complications with how gases dissolve in the bloodstream, leading to decompression sickness if you try to return to the surface.
Universally known as the bends, it is incredibly dangerous, causing intense pain, and without careful decompression protocols, it is frequently fatal.
This is where the engineering of the H2O represents a massive leap in physical adaptation. The blueprints explain that the interior pressure of this underwater resort is maintained at exactly 1 atmosphere, completely identical to the pressure you experience walking around on land.
Guests don't have to undergo hours of decompression to go inside. You just take an elevator down and walk in.
Achieving that 1 atmosphere environment requires extraordinary construction techniques. The structure is built entirely in a dry dock, floated out to the location, and then carefully sunk onto the ocean bed using a semi-submersible.
And to protect the delicate ecological environment of the seafloor, the habitat actually stands elevated on legs.
The materials have to be incredibly resilient to hold back that much pressure while maintaining a 1 atmosphere interior. They can't rely on standard glass or even steel for the massive viewing ports.
No, they utilize heavy-duty plexiglass, which has the necessary flex and strength to perform under the immense constant pressure of the ocean.
The entire habitat is connected to the surface world by a massive cylindrical umbilical tube. This tube is the lifeline, providing continuous oxygen, electrical power, heating, and ventilation from a surface buoy down to the habitat.
There was one specific detail in the architectural notes that highlights the bizarre reality of underwater living.
Oh, the maintenance choice.
Yes. The designer, Michael Schutte, noted that the exterior of the structure will actually decay much slower than it would on land because there is significantly less oxygen underwater to cause corrosion.
So, the owners are faced with a fascinating choice. They can either undergo the massive expense of hauling the entire structure to the surface every 10 years to clean and paint it, or they can simply do nothing.
They can let the ocean take over, allowing marine life to completely overgrow the exterior, effectively turning the habitat into a literal living coral reef.
It's a striking visual image, but the documentation makes it clear that this engineering is not just about luxury resorts for tourists. This represents the preliminary testing for our species' future survival.
Recent deep-sea research into hydrothermal vents has revealed a rich, largely untapped supply of minerals that could potentially be mined more efficiently than terrestrial sources.
The texts also point to massive opportunities for underwater aquaculture. We could harvest specialized marine organisms that provide the basis for new medicines. We could engineer massive floating bags of algae near the surface that photosynthesize sunlight into sustainable biofuels, and eventually, new food sources.
Just like the early farmers in the Ohio River Valley who looked at wild grasses and saw a way to feed a booming population, we are looking at the ocean and trying to figure out how to extract the resources necessary to survive our next population bottleneck.
It is the exact same survival instinct, just applied to a far more hostile environment.
We have covered some serious ground today.
We really have. Let's look at the big takeaway from this incredible stack of documents you provided. You handed us a collection of sources that seemed entirely random.
The neurobiology of language learning plateaus, the pragmatic linguistics of California teenagers, the diseased skeletons of ancient farmers, and the heavy-duty plexiglass of underwater hotels.
But together, they tell a unified story of a species that simply refuses to stay put.
Whether you are trying to master the B2 level of a foreign language by immersing yourself in emotionally engaging stories, or you are navigating the complex and often unfair social hierarchies that judge your use of uptalk or vocal fry, or you are part of a species collectively adapting from a healthy hunter-gatherer lifestyle into a grueling agricultural society, You are participating in a million-year-old human tradition.
We alter our behavior, our speech, and our very bodies to survive. We
Mhm.
are incredibly, almost ruthlessly adaptable.
We push past our perceived limits, we engineer changes to our environments, and inevitably those new environments change us in return.
Which leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to chew on as you go about your day.
Okay.
We talked extensively about how our speech naturally adapts to our social needs, like using uptalk to hold the floor in a fast-paced conversation. And we talked about our physical futures, like colonizing the ocean floor or eventually living in the deep vacuum of space. So as humanity moves into these tight, enclosed sci-fi futures, how will those extreme physical environments change the way we actually sound? If you are living your entire life in a cramped, heavy-duty plexiglass underwater habitat, dealing with completely different acoustics, higher humidity, and the echoing metal walls of a pressure vessel, will our speech naturally have to evolve?
Oh, that's interesting.
Will future generations develop a brand new version of uptalk or vocal fry just to ensure their voices carry over the constant low-frequency hum of the life support systems? Will the first permanent underwater colonies develop an entirely new dialect born out of pure environmental necessity?
Now, that is a truly fascinating question. It bridges the gap between our linguistic adaptations and our physical survival.
It really does. It's definitely something to think about the next time you catch yourself pausing to say, like, or adjusting your pitch in a meeting. You are just doing what humans have always done, adapting. Thank you so much for sending in these documents. This has been a phenomenal journey through the extremes of human potential. Until next time, keep diving deep.